This is the Konica Hexanon 50mm f1.4 lens, and I've been wanting one of these for some considerable time, and I've finally got one. Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us once again. Well, I've shot a great many vintage 50mm f1.4 lenses for this show, and today I've got another one, and it's this one. It's made by Konica. Let me just take the filter off. This is the Konica Hexanon 50mm f1.4 lens, and I've been wanting one of these for some considerable time, and I've finally got one. Now, if you're a regular viewer to this channel, you may have seen the episode in which I shot the earlier generation of Konica lens. This is the Hexanon 50mm f1.4. So we're going to be comparing this lens, the earlier generation lens, against this new one, the 50mm that I've got today. And we're also going to be taking a look and seeing how they both compare to offerings from Olympus. And what else have we got? Minolta, that's another 58, a very, very nice old 58. We're going to be looking at the Canon FD lens sitting here on the T70, and we've also got the Nikon 1.4 somewhere. Here it is, sitting on the FE at the moment. I was out shooting that recently. So we're going to be looking at all of those lenses and asking whether this one is the best one of all. Now, I have to admit, I'm a bit of a fan of Konica lenses after having used their extraordinary 40mm f1.8 lens. That's a great lens for shooting on the street. I've also used their Hexanon 50mm f1.7 lens, which is a beautiful, beautiful lens. And apparently, I was reading today, that lens, the Konica f1.7, was the lens chosen by the Japanese either Army or Air Force, one of the military forces in Japan. They tested all the other lenses, 50mm lenses, and found that that one was the best. So I'm hoping that this one shapes up to what I've found from Konica lenses that I've already used. They tend to have very, very nice colour, especially this later generation of the Hexanons have very, very nice colour, very striking colours, a colour palette that really no other lens can imitate. The older lens, the 57mm lens, when I shot it a year or so ago, I found it to be a little bit soft wide open. I'm hoping this one is a little bit sharper wide open. I shot the older one at f2.8 where it sharpens up very, very nicely, but I'm hoping this one is better wide open. So without further ado and yakking from me, let's get into the test and see what we found. So first, let's look at the lens itself, and it's a fairly average sort of size and weight for a 50mm lens at the time. They were all about this big and this heavy. This is an all-metal lens, as many, not all, but many of the vintage lenses were, probably most of the vintage lenses were. And I don't think it's got very many plastic parts, if any, on it. I think perhaps the aperture ring is made of plastic. One surprising thing is that the aperture ring seems just a little notchy to move. So that kind of surprised me a little bit. It's got double stops, or rather half stops, so you can see there from f1.4 to f1.2 actually takes two movements of the aperture ring, and all the spaces, all the apertures have double spaces. It's quite unusual to have double spaces at the widest point on the lens, but this one does, so that's a good thing. Surprisingly, the number of aperture blades is, whoop, you may or may not be able to count them there, but I've already counted them, and they are 6. So that is a fairly minimal number of aperture blades, and I was quite surprised to see that. These were not cheap lenses, clearly Konica decided that we wouldn't need any more than 6 blades, and 6 blades is what it has. So what happens there is we get a hexagon shape in the background blur if we stop this lens down. Now, some people don't mind that, others insist on a circular aperture. This lens won't give you that circular aperture, and it won't give you circular bokeh balls other than wide open. If you open it as far as it will go, then the aperture becomes circular, but the more you stop it down, the more hexagonal it becomes, and by f2.8 we are beginning to see those hexagons. I don't mind it myself. I don't personally insist on circular bokeh balls, but I know some do, so that's something to be aware of. Interestingly, the earlier lens, the Hexanon 50mm, also has only 6 aperture blades, so both of these lenses are going to give you those hexagons in the background if you stop it down. Most other vintage lenses, or the vintage 51.4s that is, have more blades. What have we got here? Olympus has 8, the Nikon has 7, the Canon has 8, the Minolta, I'm not too sure. What does the Minolta have? Oh yes, that's got quite a few. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this Minolta 58mm is another 8-bladed lens. So quite unusual for Konica to have chosen 6 blades. All right, let's get down to business. How does this lens actually shoot? Well, what I really wanted from this lens was increased colour, increased contrast and increased sharpness. And we do get those, although with 1 or 2 caveats which we'll come to shortly. Let's think about contrast first. The contrast of this lens is higher. It's perceptibly higher. You can see it. It infuses the shot and it gives a sort of a different flavour, a different feel to a shot, but it's not much higher in contrast. Wide open, this is a relatively low contrast lens. I wouldn't call it a very contrasty lens. It is higher in contrast than the older lens, the Hexanon 57mm, sorry. It is higher in contrast than that, but I wouldn't call this a high contrast lens. It's not as high in contrast, for example, as the Olympus 51.4, which has pretty high contrast. It's not a low contrast lens, but I thought it might be a bit more contrasty. Colour is very nice, very, very nice, and it does have that Konica sparkle that was lacking from the 57mm in certain situations. The 57 does make nice colour, but this one I think makes more reliably nice colour across a different range, a wider range of lighting situations. The earlier lens can more easily get knocked out by flare, and that speaks of differences in the coatings. I don't know if we can see that here. This newer lens, the one on the bottom here, has got a little more blue, I think, in its coatings than the earlier lens has, which seems to have a browny orangey sort of tint to its coatings. So the coatings are different. We can see that they're different, and those coatings I think make the newer lens that bit more resistant to flare. The older lens does flare. It flares very, very readily, but while that flare can sometimes just wash out a shot totally, it can also sometimes make magic. So when you catch the sun, this is now I'm talking about the older lens, the 57mm. When you catch the sun at the right angle on this lens, you get not washed out contrast, but just before it begins to wash out, the light plays around in the glass and makes just an incredible magic, the like of which I've rarely seen. So it does have an upside. This lens's propensity to flaring also makes it capable of that very special little trick, which the more modern lens didn't do. I think simply because it doesn't flare out as easily, it doesn't catch those rays as easily, and the coatings deal with that stray light and stop it bouncing around. So the result is, yes, you get a more contrasty lens, but you'll lose out on a little bit of extra magic that the older lens can make. Not that this lens doesn't make magic. This lens certainly makes some magical shots, and a lot of what's responsible for that is background blur. Now, both of these lenses make beautiful blur, but I think the more modern lens, the later lens, the 50mm, makes slightly nicer background blur. Both are very, very magical and filled with beautiful bubbles in the background when you shoot them wide open. But they can both be a little bit soft wide open as well. I think the more modern lens is just that little bit, just a shade sharper. There isn't much in it, and we mustn't ask too much of these lenses because they're old 1.4s. They were made for film, and the 1.4 setting really was a low light setting. You know, if you're shooting in available light and you're losing the light, then you've got an f1.4 lens, you can let much more light in. They were also often used for portraits, and portraits are quite commonly, not always, but generally shot soft. So if you're wanting to shoot a portrait, have a nice soft facial appearance and nice blurred background, you'd shoot it at f1.4. So this lens, the more modern lens, the 50mm, I think is a shade sharper, but not by very much, but it is perceptibly sharper, so that's a good thing. Can you shoot it all day wide open? Well, you can, yeah, but it's a vintage 1.4, so it's a little soft. It's not going to match the sharpness of a modern lens. It is going to give you, if you do shoot it wide open all day, it is going to give you some beautiful blur and some really lovely images because of that blur. And I don't know, it seems to have the ability to, even from about 8 to 10 feet or so, it will still blur the background if you're shooting a subject. So you're still going to get, if you shoot wide open, even if you stop down to f2.8, in fact, you're still going to get some nice blur even at some distance. But yeah, if you shoot this all day, it's a vintage 1.4, so your images will be a little soft, albeit with beautiful, beautiful blur. Having said that, I think this lens could easily and could well take the prize for sharpness in the vintage 1.4s. I think the only possible contender that might give it a run for its money is the Olympus OM Zuiko 1.4. That is quite a sharp lens for a 1.4 vintage. So maybe that's a little sharper than the Konica. Maybe the Konica's a little sharper than the Zuiko. It's very, very hard to say. Whichever it is, there's not much in it, but I think this one might just give the Zuiko a run for its money. Okay, all of these vintage 50mm lenses, especially the 1.4s, do have optical flaws and faults, and this one's no exception. Of course, it's those optical flaws and faults that we love them for, but I should say that this one does have some chromatic aberration going on, and you can see that very clearly in shots of tree branches against the sky. It's got quite a bit of the purpley greeny stuff going on wide open. It behaves itself, begins to behave itself better as you stop it down, but you know, that chromatic aberration is there. It doesn't actually bother me, to be honest, and most vintage 50mm will show some. The Nikon certainly is quite a one for the chromatic aberration. There's quite a bit of that on that lens. The Olympus less so, the Canon less so. The Canon is a rather more modern lens, I think, than all of them, even than this one. so that has very little chromatic aberration. The Minolta shows it, that's quite an old lens. Most vintage lenses show it to some degree or another. This one shows it quite prominently, and also this one shows it too, the earlier 57mm lens, but I think the more modern lens is just that little bit worse for chromatic aberration. Now, I know there are photographers who can't stand that in their shots and who recoil at the very sound of those words. Personally, it doesn't bother me, it's just part of the charm of the vintage lens. As for vignetting, well, they both show it to some extent, they both show dark corners to some extent. I think the older lens, this one, the 57mm, is a little worse. It does seem to have a little more vignetting and a little more darkness in its corners when shot wide open. If you stop it down, that gets gradually better. The 50mm does show some vignetting, does have some darkening of corners, but it doesn't do it quite as badly as the 57, and in fact it's quite a bit improved compared to that earlier lens. As for which I prefer, well, it's not terribly easy to say. The 58 has lower contrast, it's slightly softer, it flares a bit more, but it plays with the light when it does flare, or just before it flares, it plays with the light in a very magical way. And it has darker corners also. The 50mm has more contrast, it's slightly sharper, it flares in a more modern way. It does flare, but it flares in a rather a more modern way, and it gives a sort of a flash of blue through the shot, and it's a very beautiful thing. It's very clear that if you want a more contrasty shot, a slightly sharper shot, and a shot with more pumped up colours, the more modern lens is clearly the one to go for. And this is the one I'll be keeping. I'll be selling this older lens and I'll be keeping this newer 50mm. I think it's just that bit nicer. Now, I should mention, of course, that lenses from other manufacturers are available. This is one of my favourites. This is the Olympus Zuiko 50mm f1.4. I love this little lens. This was my first vintage 50 1.4, and I've kept it because it's so nice. I like the strength of contrast that it has. This is a later lens, a so-called black nose. The earlier ones had a sort of a rim of silver around here. This one's got a filter on, but if you take the filter off, you'd find, if it was an older lens, you'd find a sort of a silver front. This one has a black front. They're called black nose lenses, and they're a little bit nicer than the earlier ones. They have higher contrast, and this is a gorgeous lens. Blur can get a little bit wild sometimes and a little bit kind of tending to misbehave, but that's true with most of the vintage lenses. Generally speaking, the blur is beautiful, the contrast is good, the colour is very nice, and the sharpness is good too, even from wide open. This is a relatively sharp lens. No vintage 50 1.4 is particularly sharp wide open, but as they go, this one is a relatively sharp one. A good one of these lenses have all gone up in price, unfortunately, but they're not terribly expensive even now. A good one of these will cost you between 60, 70 to 110 pounds or so, and they're all of a similar price. The vintage 50 1.4s are all of a similar price, apart from Nikon, where you pay for, I think, essentially the name. It may be that a particular Nikon lens is better than a particular lens from another manufacturer, but by and large Nikon prices are a little higher than others, I think, because of the Nikon name and the collectability, but they're all around 60 to 110 or maybe 120, 130 in the case of Nikon, and that's not a great deal of money for a beautiful, beautiful old piece of glass. We've also got the Minolta 58. This is a nice old lens. It's an older generation of lens. This is a 1960s lens, essentially. It gives incredible colours. This lens is fantastic for colours. This is a radioactive thoriated lens, and you can see where that thorium has gone and where it's doing its work. It just makes stunning colours. So a very, very nice lens. Soft, wide open, softer than I think the Konica 50 and the Zuiko 50, but on a par with the Konica 57. A very, very nice lens indeed, and very sharp if you stop it down to f2 or 2.8. These tend to be a little cheaper, actually. I've found the Minolta lenses, PF early Minolta lenses, tend to be just that little bit cheaper than some of the other lenses, so you might want to look out for one of these. The Canon 51.4. This is a beautiful lens with rather more modern rendering than most other 51.4s. It's very sharp, it's very contrasty, and it makes great colour. The blur is really nice. These lenses are now becoming sought after for their optical qualities, and I'm really not surprised. They are quite stunning, but they are a more modern rendering. So compared to this Minolta 50mm 57mm, 58mm, in fact, get your maths right, Nige, 58mm 1.4, this is a much more modern rendering. The background blur is smoother. It can be a little wild in certain situations, but it's generally smoother than most of the vintage 51.4s. So this is a very nice lens indeed, the Canon. And then we've also got the Nikon. Which one is this? Nikon 50mm 1.4. This is a very, very beautiful lens. It's not the sharpest of this pack, I don't think. It's reasonably sharp. It's not a soft lens. You wouldn't think, oh gosh, what a dreadfully soft lens, but it's not particularly sharp either. One thing this lens does have is very good contrast and a very, very unusual colour palette. I love the colour palette of this lens. It emphasises blues and greens. It turns you know, foliage into a sort of a petrol-y blue colour. It's very, very unusual colour rendering, and that's one reason I've kept this lens, is because I like the way that it renders colour. It's quite unique. I've never seen anything like it. It does have a lot of chromatic aberration, if that bothers you, so you will see lots of purple and green separation if you're shooting the branches of trees against a winter sky, or you know, any similar situation where you've got thin, clear thin lines against a brighter background. You do get chromatic aberration from this lens, and it does have quite a bit of vignetting too, but that colour palette is just incredible. It's quite unique. The Konica colour palette is boosted and strong, and that's unique as well, but this one, I've never seen anything quite like it. This is a little bit off the wall, and it comes from the coatings. You can, I don't know if you can see the blue and the bluey greeny coatings in there, and I think that's what gives this lens its colour palette. These lenses are a bit more expensive than the rest of them here. These will go for what, I don't know, between 80 to 120 pounds, something like that. But there again, that's not a huge amount of money for what is a very, very nice old lens, and that, if you look after it, will last you as long as you want it. So which one am I taking home out of all this lot? Well, that's a really, really hard choice. Today I'm going to say it's this one, the Konica 50mm AR Hexanon, because I've just bought it and I want to play with it some more. I've shot it, but I want to shoot it again, and I really want to, you know, shoot the flipping heck out of this lens and make some nice images with it. So this is the one I'm taking home today. If you want a vintage 50 f1.4, as I say, it'll cost you between, depending on what brand and what lens you go for, anywhere between 60 to 120, 130 pounds. But if you want one, grab one quick, because they ain't making them anymore and the price can only go one way. So ladies and gents, boys and girls, thank you very much for watching today. I really do appreciate it. Thank you very much for that. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been useful, and I hope it's enabled you to gather your thoughts about which lens it is that you'd like to buy for a vintage 50 f1.4. Thank you very, very much to subscribers for your support. That is really, really appreciated. If you've liked the show, if you've enjoyed it, please chuck us a sub. That would be very much appreciated. Thank you also to patrons for your support. That is very, very much appreciated. Genuine and heartfelt thanks for that. Thank you, everybody. If you'd like to support this channel, if you think, yeah, this old hippie's not doing too bad a job of keeping the old lenses alive, then you can do that over at www.patreon.com/Zenography. Patreon.com/Zenography. You'll get there, and you can do that for as little as $1 per month. As for me, that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining me, and if you're not doing anything too strenuous or irksome next week around this time, please do join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.